Archiving started. Hello and welcome to our discussion of moral relativism. Moral relativism is a little different than traditional moral theories, as we're going to see. The question of relativism is a critical question within ethics, not only on both maybe the individual basis, but also on the cultural basis. In our lecture today, we're going to focus more on cultural moral relativism than we would say on individual moral relativism. We're going to get a little deeper into the idea of relativism. There's a couple of videos I'd like for you to watch as you go through this process. We're going to find out a little bit more about what it means to actually have disagreements about values, about conceptions of the right interculturally. First, let's take a look at the structure of the theory. In our theory, we're going to notice a few basic things. We're going to notice that, in essence, our theory is going to focus significantly upon cultural norms. So theories of the right and our theories of the good are going to be completely dependent upon cultural norms. Ideally, what's in Rome is good for Romans, so to speak, but say what's good in Milan is good for the Milanese. Cultural norms are going to also play a role for our non-moral value. That is, that ideas of intrinsic good are going to come out of these cultural norms. And our ideas about moral worth, whether or not an agent can be praised or blamed for his or her actions, is going to come from those cultural norms as well, and from how well a person adheres to those cultural norms. So our theory in a nutshell is pretty basic. It states that what is right, wrong, good, or bad for the members of a culture depends on and is ultimately determined by the basic moral norms of their culture. So our theories of right and the good, we're just going to combine them for the sake of brevity in this situation. Now, there's a very important question that we have to ask, and that is, what is culture? Understand the concept of a group. Culture is a very unusual thing, and we define it in a lot of different ways. We sometimes conceive of culture just in terms of things like geography. So people talk about, like, say, for example, the American culture. Are they talking about everybody within America? Well, within America ourselves, we have plenty of different cultures. There's certainly a different culture in Little Rock than there is, say, in Morrilton or in Eudora, Arkansas. There's a different culture that we see from the South compared to the Northeast, compared to the West. We see different cultures clearly within Hawaii versus the Inuit culture of Alaska. It's a good question in terms of how we identify culture, because after all, if we're going to base our entire theory of ethics based on cultural norms, we need to make certain that we have a good boundary for that culture. Typically, we're going to identify groups according to several factors. One is we're going to look at identity and solidarity. That is, we're going to try to understand how groups themselves identify themselves. Who's an insider and who's an outsider. And then we'd also look to find what kind of conditions or what kind of situations that they may place upon themselves, what kind of rules that allow them to identify themselves as such. So we find those common themes that allow them to feel like they're a solidarity group. We look at the structure and the hierarchy of the group. That is, we look at the way in which power flows and the way in which the group has set themselves up. So for example, let's take a look at our political culture. In our political culture, we clearly have a hierarchical system where we have a president, our hierarchy, and then within the executive branch, it goes to the vice president, and further down through various cabinet members and so forth. We look at shared attitudes. Again, what are ideas that the group uses to identify itself as being distinct and different from other groups? And we also look at shared decision-making procedures. Whenever a group can identify a shared decision-making procedure, it's going to be a good indication that they have a certain way of developing cohesion, and that decisions that are made within the group ultimately help to define what may be right or what may be wrong for the group. This could occur through things such as city councils, tribal councils. It could occur through consensus voting, a number of different things. Or it could be more autocratic in nature as well. When we look at the idea of what makes a group, we need to understand its ontology, that is, its being. How do we define it? Do we define a group via its aggregation? So do we look at individual 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we get to a certain point of individual n, and we say that all these define the group? Or do we look at it as a conglomerate? That is, it doesn't necessarily look at the individual members of the group, but instead defines them based on some other criteria or category. Now, these questions of culture are, in essence, things that we're not going to be looking too much into in this particular lecture. If you're very interested in this topic, I highly suggest that you take a look at some of the ways in which culture is defined through cultural anthropology. And I think you'll find some pretty interesting stuff. Now, speaking of that, a couple of videos I'd like for you to consider viewing. One of these is about the Aghori, who are a sect in Hinduism that practices many things which are remarkably, well, let's say remarkably uncharacteristic of most Hindu sects. For example, they do things such as touch death, something that is generally prohibited in Hindu cultures. They also proceed to take in intoxicants, and they revel in things which other people may consider to be morally wrong. It's a very interesting video, and you see, in this case, a young man who's beginning to enter into this culture, enter into this religious subculture, who has some reservations. And then the second video here involves negotiated infidelity. This is a very interesting topic, as these two individuals, Holly and Dino, have created a form of relationship which is certainly unusual. As you look at this video, consider your own relationships and consider yourself as you ask the question, would you believe that negotiated infidelity is right or wrong, good or bad, and why? Now, as we look at cultures, all cultures have some idea about moral standards. If our theory of moral relativism is correct, we need to ask a basic question. That is, how can we understandably raise critical questions about rightness or wrongness in a given culture? That is, how can I, as, say, a Southern United States citizen, for example, as a member of the particular subcultures that I may be involved in, how can I make critical judgments about individuals from a completely different culture? How could I make a critical judgment about, say, a cultural practice or a norm that exists in the middle of the Congo, within a culture there, or say within Kuwaiti culture, or even perhaps even within the culture, say, for example, in Boston? What we're going to find is that moral relativism is opposed to something we call the universality thesis. The universality thesis is as follows. There are moral norms whose correctness or validity is independent of the moral norms a culture does or might accept, and thus they express universally valid moral standards that apply to all cultures. In essence, the universality thesis states that there are certain ideas about morality that we see across cultures. And this must mean that there is some type of universal standard by which these things exist. So, for example, let's look at a prohibition on killing. Most cultures have prohibitions on killing, and the person who follows the universality thesis, or believes that morality is universal, as opposed to being particular in certain ways, may argue that this points to evidence that there is some greater moral rule, whether we're talking about some type of universal rule, divine rule, whatever it may be. Moral relativism is inherently denies this, and argues that the differences between cultures do matter. This brings us to the context sensitivity thesis. This states that the rightness or wrongness of an action performed in some particular context partly depends on non-moral facts that hold in context the question, facts concerning agents and their circumstances. Basically, what we're looking at with this theory, the conditions by which we actually make moral decisions matter. So when we look at the situations, whether it's the culture that we're living in, the time, the exact specific characteristics of the situation, that these things matter in terms of defining rightness or wrongness. This idea that non-moral facts matter in terms of our decision-making procedure also challenges that sense of universality, because we're arguing that there's not a universal standard by which we can judge every situation. That there may be situations, for example, in which a prohibition on killing doesn't apply. This brings us to maybe something that's at the heart of moral relativism, and that's the moral diversity thesis. Moral codes of some cultures include basic moral norms that conflict with the basic moral norms that are a part of the moral codes of other cultures. Basically, what we're asking here, or what the moral relativist is saying, that is that the differences that may exist between cultures are not just matters of interpretation of some universal norm, but instead that they are fundamental conflicts that do matter. That is, that there are basic differences that are irresolvable. This leads us to the anthropologist argument. This is version 1 of this, and what we're going to see is that it's not particularly appealing. Our first premise: different cultures have different moral codes. In particular, the moral codes of some cultures include basic moral norms that conflict with the basic moral norms of other cultures. Again, our moral diversity thesis. Second premise: if moral diversity thesis is true, then there are no universally valid moral norms applying to all cultures. This is a denial of the universality thesis. If we deny the universality thesis, then what is right or wrong for the members of a culture depends on the basic moral norms of their culture. Therefore, moral relativism is true. Now, when we look at this, we see some problems. First, if we look at premise 2, we may see some difficulty here. Timmons writes, one source of difficulty is premise 2, which asserts that intercultural disagreement or conflict about some matter of fundamental moral importance entails that there is no single truth about the matter in question. But why should mere difference in belief over some issue entail that there is no single correct belief about that issue? Different cultures have had, and may still have, different beliefs about the shape of the earth, some believing that it's flat, others believing that it's spherical, others perhaps believing something else. But from the fact that there are differences in belief about the shape of the earth, we do not conclude first that there is no single truth about its shape, and then, as in the above argument, go on to conclude that the truth about the shape of the earth is relative. That it is literally flat for those who believe it is flat, spherical for those who have this belief, and so on. In general, we do not suppose that mere differences in belief about a subject means that there is no single truth about that subject. What Timmons is telling us here is that, in essence, having different beliefs about moral rules doesn't necessarily deny that there may be a universal standard out there. We may have incorrect beliefs. There are also ways how we can challenge the first premise. That is, that we may argue that these differences that exist between cultures are not really fundamental differences. This brings us to the question about moral disagreements. The moral relativist is ultimately going to want to state that there are fundamental disagreements about morality between cultures. And these are different than disagreements about non-moral beliefs. Our theory about moral diversity doesn't tell us about the extent or level of disagreements that may exist between cultures, merely that there is a difference. And then we also need to try to figure out as well, how do we actually define the culture's norms? From where do we get that authority? Very few cultures have strong central themes to define what is right or wrong. For example, if we look at, say, Catholicism. In Catholicism, we see the Pope as being the primary intermediary between God and earth. The Pope does have a certain degree of moral authority based on that relationship. And therefore, the Pope can define things which are right or wrong through the issuance of papal bulls and so forth. But notice that outside of autocratic systems, we find it very difficult to define. And in fact, many times intercultural differences or intercultural disagreements occur because we have two individuals or more stating that they have a different understanding of what should be normative. Think about our basic political system, for example. In our political system, in a two-party system, we have basic fundamental disagreements about, for example, the role and size and shape of government. What do we say, that there's no fundamental difference between Republicans and Democrats? It seems like to do so is to deny some very fundamental differences. So taking this into consideration, that the moral relativist is going to argue that there are indeed fundamental differences based on these moral norms, we return to the anthropologist's argument. We're going to say that norms conflict. Again, we're asserting our moral diversity thesis. Furthermore, we're going to argue that these conflicts are what we call rationally irresolvable. Well, now, when we talk about rational irresolvability, what we're talking about is that there's no way how we can go through and create a way of understanding these things as being interrelated. That is, that we're going to say that it's just impossible for us to go through and to say that A is the same thing as B. Timmons writes, moreover, what this indicates, according to the relativist, is that when it comes to such disputes, there's no single moral truth about the matter being disputed, for if there were, we would expect more intercultural level of basic moral norms than the logical evidence suggests. Thus, moral truth is plausibly relativized to the basic norms of individual cultures. By rational means of certain moral disagreements indicates that there are no culture independent moral norms to be discovered. So again, if we take two cultural differences about prohibition, we're not going to be able to resolve these things. That brings us to our third premise. There are rationally irresolvable intercultural conflicts over basic moral norms. Our fourth premise is again where we reassert the denial of the universality thesis. The best explanation for such conflicts is that there is no universality. The universality thesis is wrong. And if it's wrong, then moral relativism, therefore moral relativism is true. Now, there are ways how we could challenge this as well. We could easily challenge, for example, premise 2. That is, that we could argue that ultimately that there are rationally resolvable differences between cultures, and that maybe further analysis of it would provide some evidence of a universality. Now, we may also ask, how do we actually criticize these judgments? Timmons gives us examples of games involving animals, such as chicken pool, for example. Ultimately, the question about moral relativism is not going to be something that we're going to easily be able to answer. Relativism is going to remain a threat to all of our theories. Now, it's a threat, however, that is a very critical threat, and perhaps a very necessary threat, as we create critical analyses of other moral theories. It's going to be very important for us to pay attention to the culture and to the time, the history, and so forth. It develops and how it continues to work. Now, as a theory itself, moral relativism doesn't really hold up. But then again, the theory doesn't really provide us with much to hold up. After all, we're defining morality based on cultural norms. So, of course, it's going to be different between cultures. That's going to give us general problems with consistency and determinacy. After all, number one, we need to figure out how we're going to define a culture, how we define subculture, things like that. At which point do we say that an individual has a responsibility to maintain cultural norms? If a member of a subculture doesn't abide by all the rules of a larger kind of superculture, does that mean that the subculture is wrong? Or, again, are we arguing they're simply involved in a disagreement? Well, also, this leads us to problems with intuitive appeal. That is, that it's going to be very difficult for us to understand how we can actually make criticisms of other moral theories, of other cultures and other cultural practices. Recently, in the United States, many state legislatures, for reasons which are not exactly legitimate, believe that they need to pass laws to prohibit the adoption of Sharia, which is Islamic law. Now, other than the fact that our Constitution simply wouldn't allow that to exist anyway, trying to figure out how these individuals can make a critical judgment against Sharia, according to at least this theory, doesn't really give us a lot of way to say it. Doesn't really give us a lot of robust argumentation against it. That is against for making any type of criticism. We also need to figure out how we understand appeals for change. That is, when we look at, say, for example, moral heroism, how do we define a person who we consider to be a moral hero? A person who is... So we look at people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. How would we say that these people are heroic if they're going against these cultural norms? How would they even have a basis for making their critical judgments against what they perceive to be injustice? This also leads us to further problems with intuitive appeal. Internal support, as we've seen, is problematic as well. The logic, maybe within the anthropological argument, doesn't hold up well. And as well, when we look at explanatory power, we don't get a very robust idea here about why certain things are right or wrong, good or bad. That's going to require us to have a very rich understanding of the culture and how that norm developed. Now, the theory is chock full of external support, however. We have entire sciences, social sciences, based around trying to understand culture. While the theory may have some problems, moral relativism is going to consistently provide us with significant questions about how we should understand morality.